Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. We're so pleased to welcome you back to PSG Consulting's first Monday webinars. And yes, we do know that it is not Monday, it is Tuesday. Or if you didn't know, it's not Monday, it's Tuesday. We hope that you had a nice summer break, and we're glad to welcome you back for our first session of the fall. Just a couple of housekeeping remarks as everybody comes in. My name is Patricia Anderson. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'll be your producer today. Also behind the scenes is my colleague Sarah, who will be providing some support. We have a couple of wonderful speakers and a really interesting topic for you today. The chat is closed to the audience, but we do really want your questions and comments. So if you would look to the bottom of your screen and find the Q&A box and post your questions there, we'd really appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our host, Paige Gardner.
Thanks, Patricia. And welcome back, and thanks for joining us. I hope the summer months were kind to everyone, apart from the incredibly brutal heat. So today's topic is a fascinating one: the relationship between various art forms and attitudinal and societal change, electoral politics, the private sector, and the evolution of contemporary culture. Art has been used as a form of oppression and rebellion, to advance false narratives or illuminate paths to a more just society. Think about these juxtapositions. Songs, stories, music, and signage, 3 notches in a tree, were used to help runaway slaves. Most of these same instruments of art informed and empowered the civil rights movement and are still used to advance social and economic rights. Now consider the art of the Jim Crow era and its power. Confederate statues, films such as Birth of a Nation, Hollywood caricatures of Black Americans, and more recent, the exclusion from the Oscars of people of color, which was brought to everyone's attention by the powerful pushback, Oscars so white. And yet art does represent our progress as a nation, wrestling with its brutal past. Think of the powerful lynching memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, the African American Museum in Washington, and the art of the Black Lives Matter movement. Art and culture pioneer, respond to, and reflect a country's culture, its values, its politics, and its successes and failures. To speak to the power of art and its relationship to dynamic change are Amy Weiss and Ken Grossinger. Today's speakers, although they have intersecting interests, represent different ways of thinking about art and social change. One from a more institutionalist approach, the other a more individualistic view. Amy Weiss is a well-known and regarded as a brilliant political and communication strategist who has worked in the highest levels of government, including the White House. She has worked as a senior official in campaigns and provided corporations and nonprofits with her communications expertise. She is the founder and CEO of Weiss Public Affairs. In this context, however, Amy has played a major role on the Board of Trustees of the National Museum of Women in the Arts for 12 years, serving on its executive committee as the communications chair. This is the first museum in the world solely dedicated to advancing and promoting women through the arts. Ken Grossinger also has a storied career. He has been one of the leading strategists in movements for social and economic justice. He has played major leadership roles in unions, community organization, and funder collaboratives. He is the director of Impact Philanthropy in a consulting firm known as Democracy Partners, which has some of the most seasoned and effective political professionals in the United States. So let's start with Amy.
Great, thank you, Paige. It's great to be here with you and Ken, and appreciate everybody showing up today on this Tuesday, first Tuesday. So I have, let's go to the first slide. As Paige said, I've been on the board of the National Museum of Women in the Arts for the past 12 years. For those of you not familiar with what we like to call NMWA, we started in 1987. This photo is the opening of the museum. It's on 12th and New York Avenues. Mrs. Holliday is there at the podium. Former First Lady Mrs. Bush is there. This actually photo looks like it's 1923, but it's in fact 1987. Many of you have been there for events, for weddings, for bar mitzvahs, but the art in and of itself is its own, like as Paige said, the only museum dedicated to women artists in the whole world. And Mrs. Holliday was a real groundbreaking person who decided many years ago in the 1970s, when she and her husband started collecting art, that there was a real need to collect underrepresented artists, women, people of different colors and ethnicities. And so she and her husband collected art and decided to open this museum, which was controversial at the time. There were some women artists that felt like this was ghettoizing women artists, that women artists should be everywhere. And Mrs. Holliday and her group felt that it was very important to have a place dedicated to women artists, given the lack of representation in museums across the world. Next slide, please. While the National Museum of Women in the Arts has been around since 1987, the numbers still aren't great. This is a survey from 2018. Of the 18 major US art museums, 87% of the collection were from male artists and 85% were white. So unfortunately, the numbers are still pretty bleak. Next slide. And then to break it down even further, looking at, again, just US, majority white male artists. White women, the numbers are getting a little bit better. Asian men, Latino men, others less than 1%. So even though the National Museum of Women in the Arts has been a real groundbreaking organization, we still have a whole lot of work to do across the country and really across the world. Next slide. And when you look at art and women artists, Judy Chicago said it best. The truth is that for centuries, women have struggled to be heard, writing books, making art and music, and challenging the many restrictions on women's lives. But their achievements have been repeatedly written out of history. This is true today, unfortunately, as it was back when Judy Chicago said this. And we continue to struggle and strive to have the women's voices heard and to shine light on the work that's been done. One of the campaigns we ran several years ago that was very successful was called "Can You Name 5 Women Artists?" And the hashtag 5 Women Artists really became very popular, because it's very hard for people to name 5 women artists. And we can do something at the end to see if people can in fact name 5 women artists, but we hope that pretty soon everybody will be able to name 5 women artists. Next slide. The Guerrilla Girls are one group that has been featured at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. They're big proponents of the work that we do. They're an anonymous artist activists who use disruptive headlines, outrageous visuals, and statistics to expose gender and ethnic bias in corrupt art, film, politics, and pop culture. They believe in the intersection of feminism that fights for human rights. And this, I think, is a really powerful statement about the Met and what this, less than 3% of artists in the Met are women, but 83% of the nudes are female. Next slide. So where are we today? Well, things aren't great, but we at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, we have closed down. We've done we're doing a total refresh at the museum. It's been about a 2-year process, a $65 million program that we're going to reopen in October. But we use this time to really continue to be the voice for change and for feminism and for women artists. And as you can see, use the building to put up this piece of art. And this was up for several months while the building was being refreshed. We are learning, I think one of the things Ken talks about in his book that he'll talk about, I'm sure, is, the pandemic was a real turning point for museums. And I can only speak about Nîmois, but we really used that time to reach people outside of 12th and New York Avenue. How do we reach people virtually? How can we bring art into people's homes and into schools across the country and across the world? and it was a turning point for the museum. And I think once the museum opens, I actually know that we will be much more accessible to the public that's here in Washington and outside of DC. So you can do the next slide. So this is a prototype photo of what the new museum will look like upstairs. We are going to reopen to the public on October 21st. We're going to have a renovated and updated performance hall with state-of-the-art technology. Will be much more ADA compliant. And the gallery space will be expanded by about 15%. So we'll have almost 19,000 square feet of exhibition space to be able to show more women artists and go deeper into collections. And we can go to the next slide. Just so this is yet another photo of what the museum will look like. And I hope for those of you in Washington or coming to Washington will come by the opening events at the end of October. So thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here with you. And Amy, thank you for that. Thank you for your good work that you've done in the past that I'm familiar with, and for the work that you're doing now at NEMWA. And special thanks to Paige Gardner for hosting this event. And, you know, Paige is in my view, one of the leading electoral strategists in the nation. And so the question is, why is somebody that has dedicated her life to that now talking about art and culture? And it relates very much to my own history and what gave rise to my book. As Paige mentioned, I've spent probably 25 years in the organizing community. I was at the AFL-CIO running their legislative field operations, doing the same at the Service Employees International Union, and then worked for community organizations. And during that time, when I learned how to think about organizing, when I practiced my craft, and when I started teaching younger organizers how to think about their work, art and culture were never a part of what we did. And then I married an artist, and I realized I missed a huge boat. And my wife, Micheline Klagsbrun, who's a DC-based artist, and I started a foundation called the Cross Currents Foundation, which funds at the intersection of art and social justice. And it was through that experience at the foundation that I learned that it wasn't just organizers who didn't think strategically about how to use art and culture in their work, but it was artists themselves that didn't think strategically about using their work in the service of social movements. And so my book is an attempt to help fill that gap. And let's go to the first slide, Patricia. So the first point that I want to make is that art is not just a reaction or a reflection of society or social movements, but it is a contributor to social change. And that's a very different way of looking at art if you're into the world of politics and into the world of organizing. And so I wanted to share two examples, one historical and one contemporary, to make this point. The first is this image that you see that was taken by Danny Lyon in 1963. As many of you know, during the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of Northern activists went south to work with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And James Forman, the head of SNCC at the time, realized that if he wanted to expose the brutality of white supremacy in the South, that he needed uncontestable or incontestable visual evidence that it was taking place. And so Danny Lyon was among the group of volunteers who, in his case, came down from New York. He was a self-taught photographer. And James Forman sent him out on a mission. And the mission was to find these girls. There are not 33 that you can see in this photo, but there are 33 girls in total that was swept up at a movie theater in Georgia for protesting racial segregation. and they were detained for 45 days without their families knowing where they were or their communities. And Foreman sent Lyon out with 2 civil rights workers to find them and to capture them on camera to demonstrate what was going on. And so they realized at some point that the girls were locked in this stockade in Leesburg, Georgia, and the 2 civil rights workers distracted the guards, and Danny took this image through shard glass that was broken in front of bars. And James Foreman distributed this image to Jet Magazine, which published it. It went to Senator Harrison, which introduced it into the congressional record. And then eventually it wound up in the hands of Robert F. Kennedy, who at that time was the Attorney General, and these girls were swiftly released. So it's only one form of art photography. And when I think about art, I think about it broadly: music, theater, film, song, and so forth. But it demonstrates that art is not just a reflection or a reaction, but a contributor to social change. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a more contemporary example of that same point. In 2013, a street artist named Justin Nethercutt, his street name was Nether, joined forces with a housing organizer, a woman named Carol Ott, because they wanted to draw attention to the blighted buildings in Baltimore. As those of you who have been through or been in Baltimore know, it's one of the last of the East Coast cities, which has rows and rows and rows of dilapidated homes. And so Justin approached Micheline and I for support for his idea. And I said in as diplomatic tone as I could that murals on the sides of dilapidated buildings were going to draw some attention to it, but they really weren't going to change anything. And he said, yeah, but. And his yeah, but was that I'm going to put up a QR code next to each mural. In this case, you're looking at a mural of a raven with the colors of the football team, the Ravens, also the home of Edgar Allan Poe and his poem, The Raven. And he said the QR code, when you scan it, up pops the name of the slumlord who owns the building and the names of the politicians which represent that district. And I said, okay. And so here's what happened. 2 days after this mural and QR code went up, the mural was left intact, but the QR code was ripped down. And Justin went back and put it back up 2 days later after that. And within 2 weeks, if you can imagine what it's like to get a demolition license in Baltimore in terms of the amount of time it takes, within 2 weeks, this building was demolished. And that garnered some press attention. Channel 2, I think, said that it was art aimed to shame. And so Justin planned on doing 15 of these murals. And so the second mural went up with the QR code, the third mural went up. And in the case of the fifth mural, the street artist's name was Gaia. Gaia made a picture of Pharaoh wearing a golden headdress, but instead of looking out over Egypt, he looked out over a cotton plantation. And the word exile was written in Hebrew along the bottom. And the landlord went ballistic and called up the Baltimore Sun, the daily newspaper in Baltimore, and said, I want to say two things. One, this is the idea of Jews keeping down blacks in the ghetto. The landlord was Jewish. And two, I don't own this building. So the Baltimore Sun did a page and a half, what I think about as a hatchet job, on this murals project because of that. And so Justin got a call from the Baltimore Weekly, which at that time was the progressive alternative to the Baltimore Sun, for comment. And then they called up the reporters at the Baltimore Sun. And they asked the reporters mostly just one question. Did you report what the landlord said, or did you research it? And in fact, the Baltimore Weekly invested their own money in independent research and determined that this landlord had been cited 500 times for lead paint. And in fact, he did have controlling authority of this building. And so that then created a volley between the Baltimore Weekly and the Baltimore Sun. And each time a new mural and QR code went up, more press, radio and TV would cover it. So fast forward to the end of the summer of 2013, the mayor had it and increased their demolition and renovation budget from $2.2 million to more than $20 million. So again, it's the notion that art contributes to social change, not just reflects it. Let's go on to the next slide. The second point that I want to make is that organizing and advocacy, social protests and protest movements can often lead to legislative or policy changes. But what happens is when power changes hands, those changes get rolled back. And so the pendulum keeps swinging from the left to the right and from the right to the left. And that is in part because the narratives underlying these fights never get addressed. And so the next two slides are just kind of easy examples to look at of narrative change that artists try to assert. And so this is a picture of a monument called Rumors of War by Kehinde Wiley. Most of you remember that in the thick of the Black Lives Matter movement, Confederate generals sat on top of a lot of these monuments and were flashpoints for protest throughout the South and actually throughout the country. And what Kehinde Wiley did was to remove the Confederate generals and put on the horse, I'm not sure if you can see it from this image, a muscular Black horseman, a young man wearing dreadlocks and sneakers, to change the way that an elevated monument looks, to change the story, to change the narrative about heroes. It was no longer just the Confederate generals that are being glorified. It's now young Black men. Let's move to the next slide. And this is another recent example of narrative shift work that is being undertaken by a French photographer and muralist named J.R., who took this photo of Kikito, a one-year-old baby boy, in his crib, and then blew it up to 70 feet tall, propped up on scaffolding and plywood, looking out over the US-Mexico border. And this was happening at a time that Trump was trying to do away with DACA and was instituting his family separation policies. And so on the one hand, you have this narrative that Mexicans are vile, rapists, and so forth, that Trump was perpetuating. And then you look at this kid and you have instantly a different reaction to what's going on. So narrative shift is a role that artists can play in ways that organizers, quite frankly, can't. How am I doing on time?
Got about 4 minutes left.
Okay, let's move on to the next slides. The next point I want to make builds upon what Amy was describing, which is that I think museums will either become community action targets if they don't respond to their times, or they will become community building institutions. And therefore, it's important for people that are involved in politics and organizing to think about them in strategic ways. This slide represents a campaign that Nan Golden, a photographer, has been waging against the Sacklers for many years. She started an organization called PAIN. She herself was addicted to OxyContin and was furious at the way in which the Sacklers were art washing their name, trying to burnish their reputation as art patrons rather than killers. And so this is a picture of the Temple of Dandor at the Met in New York City, of a die-in that she organized with pill bottles in the temple. And there are many stories like this where museum workers themselves and community activists are starting to go after museums. They went after Warren Candor's at the Whitney Museum. They went after David Koch at the American Museum of Natural History and so forth. So museums have become community action targets. Let's go on to the next slide. but they've also become places of activism. And the next two slides that I want to discuss reflect that. This is, and Paige referenced it in her opening remarks, a picture of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. This is a memorial created to the legacy and history of lynching. And what you're looking at is some of 805 Corten steel beams that are hanging, and inscribed in the steel are the names of some of the people that were lynched and the county and towns in which those lynchings took place. And what the National Memorial did in connection with the Legacy Museum is to create replicas of this, so that when people came from around the country to see this, when they recognized either their ancestors or the towns or counties that were reflected in the steel beams, they could bring those replicas back and organize some type of racial justice event, whether that was just markers signifying what had happened, or whether that was fodder used to promote racial justice. It was a way in which museums could take their work and have it brought into the community to build. Let's go on to the next slide. And I'll wrap up with this one. But I wanted to tell this story because it's really instructive about the way in which museums are changing. You're looking at a picture of Breonna Taylor. Many of you will remember she was a 26-year-old Black woman who was killed in her apartment while she was in bed by police who had entered her apartment. And Ta-Nehisi Coates approached an artist named Amy Sherald, who did the portrait of Michelle Obama that's hanging in the Natural Portrait Gallery, and asked her if she would do a portrait of Breonna Taylor for the cover of Vanity Fair magazine. And Amy said yes, but she also wanted it shown in Louisville, which is where Breonna Taylor was from. And so the director of the Speed Museum, a guy named Stephen Riley, was grappling with the question of what it means to be a museum in the middle of Black Lives Matter and in the hometown of Breonna Taylor. And what he decided to do was to empty 4 of his galleries within the museum to create space for new work reflecting what was going on. And what he did, which is so important, is although he had a curator, he created 2 advisory committees. One was a national advisory committee made up of people of color who are also artists who had family members killed or maimed by the police. And the second was a local advisory committee, which was made up of mental health workers, legal advocates, community activists, and so forth. And it was between those 2 advisory committees that decisions were made about what would go up and what would not. And those committees didn't always get along. For instance, the National Advisory Board just wanted 30 pieces of good art. The local advisory board said, yes, we need 30 pieces of good art, but all the artists had to be Black. And so Stephen Riley ultimately and continually deferred to these 2 advisory boards and to Tamika Palma, Breonna Taylor's mother, and her family about what would go up, working in conjunction with a curator. And Sadiqa Reynolds, who was the head of the Urban League in Louisville, said to me that it was the first time that my people ever felt welcomed into the museum. So they flipped the dynamic on its head from a curator-driven operation curator who would decide what people wanted to see and what was worth seeing, to something that was driven by input from national and community boards. And with that, I'll wrap up so that we can begin to go into Q&A.
Thank you, guys. Really, really fascinating, and does show the power of art. And it's like looking through a prism. It reflects things in so many different ways in terms of a country. But let me start with Amy. I was stunned by the statistics of how many men, white men, and in the US are represented and overrepresented in the art that we see. And then you hear Ken and some of the more exciting work that's happening across the country and obviously in the museum in which you serve. So can you give me a little bit of a sense of where you see the museum as an institution going in the future, and how it's responding to the increased diversification of this country and the rapid diversification of this country?
Absolutely. I think that we understand times have changed since 1987. And I think with the revamp of the museum, we are really looking to get outside of our own four walls, how many walls there are at the museum. And, we know that even, white women, Black women, Asian women, people that don't identify as women, looking at sort of the broader world that we live in today, how do we represent everybody? And, it's something that we take seriously. It's something that we're looking at for the long term. And working with chapters across the country, and working with chapters literally across the world. We have different advisory groups throughout the world, bringing in their viewpoints as well. So I think you'll see different exhibits at the National Museum of Women in the Arts coming up. And I think you'll see much more focus on virtual events and reaching outside of our own, institution itself.
And I have a question, and thinking about the last slide you saw, which is museums can bring in diverse artists and other viewpoints and what really, art is. How do they build an audience for that? I mean, you do mention in your book that the people who go to museums are, hopefully they're increasing in numbers, but how do you then, if you build it, will they come essentially in terms of some of the more interesting art? How do you build an audience and a different kind of audience?
Well, it's a $64,000 question that museum directors grapple with all the time. My sense is that they're already starting with a base, and the question is what will draw in a wider universe of people. And I think, as Amy said, it's the work of art itself and the artists themselves that will draw, in the way that Sadiqa Reynolds said it was the first time that her community felt comfortable going to the Speed Museum. I think we'll see that kind of dynamic around gender, race, and class issues. And so I'm sort of less worried about that because I'm not responsible for raising the budget of these museums. But nevertheless, I think that that's the way we have to approach this. So when I'm on the board of the Hirshhorn Museum, and the Hirshhorn Museum did a blockbuster exhibition of Mark Bradford, did a blockbuster exhibition of Ai Weiwei, and that brought in new segments of the community that hadn't otherwise been there. And I think NMOA is doing the same kind of thing.
Chris, you want to open it up to audience questions?
Sure. I don't see any just yet, so I'll encourage everybody, if you've got questions, please pop them into the Q&A, but I will pick up with one. I'm curious to hear from all of you actually about how the changing of our times is changing the way people consume art and how that might impact their activism. So I'm thinking about TikTok, I'm thinking about Instagram, I'm thinking about the pandemic where the physical museum couldn't be accessed, but people still needed access to not only create art, but to consume it. So what are some of the things that you're seeing from your roles, as leaders in museums, which I think people in my generation, I'll speak for myself actually. I'm in my mid 40s and I've always thought of a museum as a place to visit the past, not necessarily a place to encounter art and activism that's of today. And I see that changing in real time. So I'm just curious what you see coming from the new media, the new world, so to speak.
Well, I would just make one point and then kick it over to Amy, who probably has better insight into this. The Black Lives Matter movement was fueled in large part by social media. It wasn't just tens of thousands of people turning out for demonstrations. That's kind of activism was fueled. So you had musicians not only performing live in Ferguson, Missouri, you had musicians performing live on YouTube. Some of those musicians literally had tens to hundreds of millions. Danny Childish Gambino Glover had over 800 million views of his song during the Black Lives Matter movement, a song whose name I'm forgetting at the moment. But we saw that. We saw digital projections. We saw a whole range of things that activists were able to do from their homes, which had an impact. Now, what kind of impact has it had relative to the kind of organizing that old dinosaurs like me do? You know, it's a question, but it's a really, it's really true that social media has mediated the relationships between art and activism in a new kind of way.
Yeah, Ken, I agree with you. And I think at NIMWA, I said this earlier, we really took advantage of the pandemic to reach out to people and do many more virtual events, which we'd never really done before. And I think we were able to reach new audiences. And I think you also see museums here, the Renwick had Burning Man art that they brought in. And I think that brings in a whole new exciting group of people who might not go to a museum. Like, Patricia said, some people think it's going to be like old, boring, drawings that you've seen from yesterday, but this is really today. And I think the more museums do that, the better. I think I'm going to be your publicist right now. I think this book is a great book about how to take politics and museum activism, taking the, as you said, the community organizers. I love that chapter about, how do you get community organizers to work at museums? And that's exactly the sort of thing we need to be doing more of, more grassroots outreach rather than, the grass tops, and making sure people in our own communities are able to access and take advantage of the museums that we have here in Washington specifically.
You're hired.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have a question that I wanted to also ask. And I want to get this quote right, so let me read it. There was a quote in your book, Ken, that really drew my attention, which is, donors should not be making strategic organizational decisions, nor should we be doing forced marriages. So many of the people on this call have had experiences raising money for organizations, and there has been that kind of tension. But then the question becomes, how do donors make investment decisions? And what should one do as one is considering investing in this kind of art to bring about social change? And what are the criteria that one might use?
So I want to make one or 2 points and then tell a story. And the first point is about the history of cultural philanthropy. It's sordid. As Amy was alluding to earlier, it was driven by white male philanthropists investing in elite art institutions and had little to do with what was going on in the community. So that's where we started from. And that's what's given rise to so many of the race, class, and gender issues that we're dealing with. But philanthropy is beginning to change, though very slowly. And the story that I wanted to tell was of a project called the Art for Justice Fund. The Art for Justice Fund was started by a woman named Agnes Gunn. Aggie is what her friends called her. She was the chair of MoMA for many years. She is a major philanthropist. She's an arts patron and also funds a variety of progressive causes. And Aggie saw Ava DuVernay's film 13th and was infuriated. 13th drew the connections between the Atlantic trade slave and mass incarceration in a way that a lot of other films never did. And she calls up Darren Walker, who is the president of the Ford Foundation, and says, Darren, we need to do something about mass incarceration. And so Darren convened a meeting with Elizabeth Alexander and Brian Stevenson and several other people to begin to hash through what might be done to end mass incarceration. And Aggie's idea was to sell a painting that she had bought that Roy Lichtenstein made in 1962 called The Masterpiece. And Aggie was friends with both Roy before he died and subsequently with Dorothy, who's still alive and active. And she called up Dorothy and she said, how would you feel about me selling Roy's painting to raise money to end mass incarceration? And Dorothy loved the idea. And Aggie sold that painting for $160 million and invested 100 million of that 160 in something she called the Art for Justice Fund, focused exclusively on mass incarceration. 30% of the dollars that they distributed went to those who are incarcerated or who had recently come out of incarceration, or to the families of those who are incarcerated. And like the Speed Museum, although very different format and context, they created advisory boards made up in part of incarcerated people and families of the incarcerated to inform where their funding decisions should be made. So it wasn't a program officer reporting to a program director, reporting to the executive director, reporting to the board to get sign off on investing funds in this. It was actually people that were closest to the issues who were on the ground making those decisions. And that kind of approach is being taken by the Pop Culture Collaborative, by the Constellations Change Fund. There are a number of foundations that are beginning to get at this problem that you raised, Paige. It's because it's a really important problem, and we've only barely begun to break the ice on it.
Amy, what do you think? Been in the donor world a lot.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Your original question?
It was how donors make investment decisions about art and how that's changing, but how some of the sort of built-in problems in terms of directed funding still remain.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak about what we do at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. The original collection was from Mrs. Holliday and her husband, and they were big donors. But today, I will say that the curators make decisions about what the exhibitions are going to be, and it's not board driven, it's not donor driven. We also are very careful about who we take money from and don't take money from. We're not pure, but we're pretty darn good and have a pretty strong ethic about that. So I think it's important to have those boundaries and to have a compass of right and wrong and who you're going to take money from, but we don't let the donors nor board direct what we're going to show at the museum. So
I wanted to comment on that because the National Museum does a great job at that, but there are other museums that do not.
correct.
So for instance, I mentioned the American Museum of Natural History earlier on in the discussion. David Koch was on the board of the American Museum of Natural History. David Koch has put not tens, but hundreds of millions of dollars into climate denial. And so imagine that you're a curator at the American Museum of Natural History that wants to do an exhibition on climate change. Koch doesn't have to ever open his mouth to have an impact on what the curator or the curator's director might decide they want to do. So there are many ways in which boards and directors do affect curatorial decisions that are not necessarily explicit to the public.
That's a good point. And then just on taking the other side, how do organizations and institutions like museums or funds judge their efficacy and their impact? It's not, as someone who knows a lot about randomized control trials, this is not a randomized control trial.
Right. I mean, and I'll just talk from our perspective at the museum. It's hard to really tell what your impact is. Is it how many tickets you sell? I mean, you have to pay to come in the front door. One of the few museums in Washington that you do have to pay. So is it how many tickets we sell, how many students that, how many classes come through? To many people, it's how many other museums are featuring women artists, how many others are doing exhibitions on some great, women artists or African-American artists who are underrepresented, or other ethnicities that are underrepresented. That to me shows our efficacy and our ability to affect others. And we do partner with other museums and lend our work out to them so they can have these exhibitions across the country, in small museums, or in I don't want to say little towns, but in smaller museums in smaller places in Washington, D.C. So that's how I sort of judge our impact. But I'm up here with Ken. Ken's take.
I would just add that the judgment is very different in the organizing and political world than it is in the art world. One is organizers think about metrics. They think about things that they can measure. They think about quantifiable impacts that can then be used to inform strategic directions. Artists think about qualitative assessments. And it's the marriage of quality and quantity that we're really talking about. And it's the reason why I'm so happy Paige has organized this event, because we need to think about both. Change on an artist's timeline is much different than change on an organizer's timeline. Organizers want things done yesterday. They want things done today. They want things done in the next election, which is never so far off. Artists, Hank Willis Thomas, who some of you know, the photographer based in Brooklyn, New York, great artist, he said change on his timeline was 10, 20, 30, and 40 years, because he's getting at shifting narratives. He doesn't want to just fight the immediate fight that political and community organizers are battling. He wants to shift the narrative. So we need to find a way to marry the quantitative with the qualitative to do our work in a way that is long-lasting.
I think that's also true on the sort of electoral public policy side as well, which is a whole other conversation. One of the things, the most fascinating pieces of the work of art, in my view, is the emotion it evokes. If you see something, a piece of art, you have a visceral reaction to it in one way or another, and it's purposeful. And the art is intended to make you feel something. I think that is also missing in some of the words elected officials use, because they are not very clear sometimes about what exactly they want to evoke viscerally in someone. And if you think about art, if you think about politics and how people make decisions, a lot of it is visceral. And I think we can learn a lot from the art world, not only about measurement and how to think about measurement differently, but also about emotion and how the intention to evoke a particular emotion is critical to art success. And it also is critical to the success of a political narrative.
In my book, I have a chapter that's a roundtable discussion between artists and organizers, focusing on collaboration, or the difficulties associated with it, what makes it work. And one of the things, to your point, Paige, that Shepard Fairey says in that chapter is that unless people are emotionally primed to think about new ideas, it might never penetrate their defenses. And art, as you've just said, has the capacity to touch the heart and our souls in a way that organizers speak, in a way that in my entire career, I would never be able to do. And if I wasn't 69 and I had another 69 years to live, I would fundamentally change that. I'm not sure that I would undertake any significant campaign that didn't have a very strategic art and culture component.
Looking at the slides that you showed, Ken, the photo of the baby was just so powerful. And just the issues at the border, that baby photo just struck me personally, and I just thought, like, wow, like, how can you use that? How can we use that to garner support for all of the different issues that we're facing today? So I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, go ahead,
sorry,
Patricia.
Paige. I was just going to say, we do have
ahead.
a couple of questions from the audience. So I wanted to acknowledge Yossi, who identified the Donald Glover Childish Gambino song, which is "This Is America," and I found the link, the official YouTube link. I've posted that to the chat for y'all. Katie Sullivan says, "I'm curious about breakthrough new narratives. Do you see political message consultants guiding artists, or artists guiding / illuminating the message consultants?" And Amy, that's maybe a little bit of what you were just getting at. Would you like to share more about that? Ken, do you have anything to add on that concept?
I'll let Ken take it, because other than my opining, I don't have any hard facts.
Well, I really want Amy and Paige to take this, but I would just say that one of the dynamics that are problematic with integrating art and culture with organizing is this whole question of messaging. A lot of community organizations, and Paige is world-renowned for doing this, use polling to inform the messaging, and that's just a smart, strategic thing to do. But artists don't want their impulses stifled by what a political message should be. They're able to have success because they burst through that. And so it's in my mind, it's one of the things that calls for trust, that political operatives and community and labor organizations need to trust that if they found a good artist, that they should let them do their work. With that, we can move forward collaboratively. And without that, I don't think the possibilities of collaboration are great.
Thank you.
If you think about, I was thinking about this as Ken was speaking. If you think about the power of art, whatever kind, it's the power of a narrative. It's the power of telling a story, whether it's, a poem, a song, a visual. And the art of politics, successful politics, is the art of a narrative that moves people. And so I think, to the extent that art can inform how to construct a better narrative for practitioners, would be an enormous contribution.
And as Yossi could tell us, who's done really groundbreaking work in this world, a lot of organizations are beginning to embrace both. I forgot Yossi can't respond, so shout out to Yossi.
Thank you, Ken. Well, I want to wrap up with one really provocative question, or thought-provoking is a better way to describe it, from Finale, who's saying, the way that Mamie Till created art by opening the casket of her son. So she took it. I would imagine that was not her intent, but there's a moment there that is so powerful, and lives on, and is, there's a film about her. Where else might we have those moments today where the art comes after the moment, so that it sort of extends the message of the thing that happened?
Amy?
Well, I was going to say, it seems that, the issue of climate change and all that we've faced in the past month, if you think about Maui, Morocco, you name it, even here at home in Florida. I mean, that to me, I mean, just doing art around that to keep reminding people what's happened. I mean, to me, that's like sort of the, something that's so visual and so impactful. And unless you see it firsthand or see the photos and the art of it, it's hard to really grapple with the magnitude. So I feel like somebody will turn that into art at some point. And I think that's one way to keep some stories at front of mind through art.
One of the things I want to end with, Amy, is do you want to make an announcement about the museum and the opening and what we can expect?
First, I'd like to say you can buy this book on Amazon. But secondly, my other hat, we are reopening on October 21st. We're going to have a week long of events. If you go to our website, you can see all of the different events. I think they're actually being announced on the 15th. But if anybody here on this webinar wants to come to any of our events, please let me know. I'm happy to get you an invitation. And you can sign up as a member. I think it's $180 a year, which is like, nothing. It's, a dinner for two at the Palm or something. And you can be a member for a year and come to some of the opening events. So it's going to be very exciting. We have our first and final walkthrough tomorrow at the museum. So I'm excited to see how it's progressing.
Well, congratulations on the work that you've done there. And Ken, congratulations on your book. It's stunning.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for joining. And we'll see you next month.
Thank you so much.